ஏனோ ஒரு இனம் புரியாத பந்தம் எனக்கு அந்த அழகிய கிழவியுடன். நான் மொழியாத வழி அவளுக்கு எப்படி புரிந்தது? உலகமயத்தில் மாயமாய் நழுவி சென்று கொண்டிருந்தாள். உலகமயத்தில் மாயமாய் நழுவி சென்று கொண்டிருந்தாள். பின்னால் ஒளி அவளை கட்டி அணைத்துக் கொண்டு முத்தமிட்டேன். நாவில் அமிழ்தம் சுரந்தது. பேர் என்னம்மா என்றேன். முத்தமிழ் என்றாள். பேர் என்னம்மா என்றேன். முத்தமிழ் என்றாள்.
இது சொல்லிலடங்கா,
இளையர்களின் இலக்கிய பயணம். பன்மொழிகளும் பல்வேறு கலாச்சாரங்களும் உள்ள இந்த நாட்டுல வெவ்வேறு மொழிகள்ல இலக்கியம் காலம் காலமாக படைக்கப்பட்டிருக்கு. கடந்த பாகங்கள்ல நாம சிங்கை தமிழ் இலக்கியத்தை மையப்படுத்தி பேசினோம்.
இன்றைக்கு சற்று வேறுபட்ட முறையில நமது தாய்மொழி இலக்கியங்களை பார்க்க போறோம். மேண்ட்ரின் மற்றும் மலாய் இலக்கிய வெளி சிங்கப்பூர் வரலாற்றுல எப்படி இருந்துச்சு, சம காலத்துல எப்படி இருக்கு அப்படிங்கறதையும் பார்க்க போறோம்.
வணக்கம் நேயர்களே, இது சொல்லிலடங்கா, இலக்கிய ரசிகர்களுக்கான ஒரு தொடர்.
சிங்கப்பூர் தமிழ் இலக்கிய வெளிக்கு ஓர் அறிமுகம்.
நான் ஆயிலிஷா,
நான் அஸ்வினி. இந்த தொடருக்கு ஆதரவளிக்கும் தேசிய கலைகள் மன்றத்துக்கு எங்களுடைய நன்றி.
To our listeners connected with us today, did you know that in 1965, a team of eminent writers and academics had attempted to organize a poetry festival to showcase our different cultures and languages?
But that dream was never realized until 2015, when we had our very first National Poetry Festival, now called Poetry Festival Singapore, where poetry in our 4 official languages shared a platform. And today, our guests on the show were part of that organizing team in 2015 that curated a 3-day festival featuring local poetry and more than 35 local poets, what has now become an annual festival that is running successfully till today. Ayilisha, did you participate in PFS 2020?
Yes, I did, Ashwinii. I participated in the 3-day festival online, and there were many events. Lots of poetry recitals, talks, and one memorable one was the poetry appreciation and sharing session that was led by Indian Tamil poet Samraj that I attended, where we could actually just choose our own poems and recite them and talk about how we felt about them. And I think you can guess what my favorite was.
Yes, I think I know. It must have been Professor Edwin Tambu's poetry reading with the dance accompaniment by Bhanupriya from Apsara's Arts.
Yes, it was, Ashwini. I mean, Edwin Tambu's voice, right? That voice together with Bhanupriya's dance and with Indian classical music as the background, that was just mesmerizing. We have with us today 2 members of the organizing team of PFS ever since it started in 2015. So let's welcome Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, a lecturer at the Malay Studies Department of the National University of Singapore, and also Dr. Chee Lay, a Mandarin poet and an associate professor in Chinese at the National Institute of Education at the Nanyang Technological University. Hello there, Dr. Tan and Dr. Azhar, or should I say hello over there? It's pretty interesting, right, sitting in this setup. And okay, for our listeners to visualize, we are keeping our safe distance here while recording at the studio. And I think it's really nice talking over this distance about literature that really connects us so deeply together. So tell us, Dr. Tan.
Hello over there. Although we are far apart, I think literature and poetry keeps us close to each other.
Definitely.
Yes,
and
I totally agree.
How was your experience of PFS 2020 going virtual, right?
It was quite surreal in the first sense because this is the first time that we are organizing this poetry festival online. We had it in 2015, the first stint of the poetry festival. Everybody come together. You feel this sense of togetherness and seeing each other embracing poetry together. However, this time around, we feel a little bit strange when we are only online and seeing each other in a very small screen in front of you. So that is something which we need to get used to, right, Azhar?
Yeah. When we first started, 4 official languages in terms of its poetry coming together, it's already a big start, right? In that sense of giving space and recognition for poets, writers in all the four languages. Coming online this year, of course, we need to make some adjustment, but generally, I think people kind of like accept that this is the reality today in that sense. But well, let's keep it an open mind.
Yeah.
You never know that, even next year, touch wood, we will be still online.
There were some poets who said this is the way to go because this is the way to connect people from all over the world. So what happened was we have people from China, from Taiwan, from Malaysia,
Yes,
from
Indonesia.
Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. So coming online together, so we get to have this sense of the world coming together to read poetry.
Which was initially meant for like kind of national, right? I mean, like kind of localized. But this time round, our PFS is really international, in terms of its people reading, in terms of the viewers, from via Facebook. It's tremendous.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like keeping the world connected together with literature, right? So I think it would be nice for us to start with a little history. We know that our literature in the mother tongues, both Malay and Mandarin, they've come a long way in Singapore's history. So how can we trace their evolution up to this point? Maybe we can have Dr. Azhar start.
Well, if you want to start for Malay literature in Singapore, I mean, since they, even before colonial period, right? The literary tradition, right, concerning Singapore Malays, which is integrated to the larger Malay-Indonesian world. Singapore or Singapura has always been the central feature of the Malay world. So many of the classical elements from the Malay-Indonesian world, Singapore is part and parcel of its heritage too. But the interesting part, of course, modern Singapore post-1819, right? And you begin to see that the Malay literature that evolved is the one that undertake the kind of dissenting voices against colonialism, at the same time a kind of reformative outlook in terms of putting together the indigenous community in this process of modernization and development. So on that sense, Malay literature in Singapore has that very strong societal commitment.
And how about Mandarin literature then?
How did we start? Right, there were people who said that we only started in 1965 when Singapore was founded. However, when we look at Singapore Chinese literature, it started way before that. Right, actually about 700 years ago, when travelers from China traveled to this part of the world and they wrote about this place, the geography, the people, and so on. It was written and it was recorded in historical books. And of course, the very famous Zheng He, who came down from China to this part of the world, he bring along a lot of literati on his ships, right, on his fleet. And these people, when they record, they also record the places, the geography, the history, and even the food, the people here. So there was also some very good records that we have that form part of Singapore Chinese literature. So it was a long time, and we do have very good tradition and origin to rely on, and we see it developing over this 700 years.
And if I may add a bit, since we have written record too, both in Chinese and Malay, but there's also what we call the oral tradition. The common stories among the people, right?
Yeah.
And that is also a kind of a living literature that one has to acknowledge too. And there's a lot of things on Singapura, from all this part of the world, relating to Singapura or relating to the very people who live in this island.
I think these are very interesting and important historical facts that you both have brought up. And speaking of the history of our literature, that brings us to our next question on diaspora literature, and where Singapore mother tongue literature stands there. We tend to use these yardsticks to compare. So for example, in the case of Tamil literature, there's a tendency to compare with Indian Tamil literature, Malaysian Tamil literature, Sri Lankan Tamil literature, which is only natural because it's literature in a common language. So do you see these yardsticks being used in Mandarin and Malay literature, and how do you perceive them?
Well, for the case of Malay literature, it's slightly different when you want to use the word diaspora, because it's indigenous, right? So in that sense, within Malaysian literature or Indonesian literature, or for that matter from this region, it's kind of hard to look at where the diaspora come in, because people in this region don't move out, right? they tend to stay in this region, right? So that's one. Except that the creation of nation states, then you can see where, literature being delineated as this is Malaysia, this is Indonesia, this is Singapore, this is Brunei, and so on and so forth. And then we have a problem of counterclaims of which literature that belongs to. For example, Munshi Abdullah. Munshi Abdullah, for sure, he wrote from in Singapore and published things in Singapore, but he was from Malacca. So the Malaysian are claiming, well, Munshi Abdullah belongs to us. Whereas Singapore say, well, Munshi Abdullah worked in Singapore. But then, when you look at the history of Indonesian literature, the first part of Indonesian literature covers Munshi Abdullah. Because the Indonesian trace, the modern Indonesian literature, it traces its legacy from the start of Malay works in 19th century, which is another claim here. So we don't have a problem of diaspora, but we have a problem of this nation-state dividing which literature belongs to one another.
I think that's a really unique situation then for Malay literature. And then, what about Mandarin literature?
Well, somewhat similar in Chinese, Well, over the past 100 years, when literati from China came over to Singapore, of course, when they think about publishing their work and where to submit and where to let people read, they will tend to go back to China, or to send their works back to China, because that's where the most readers were. That's in the past, in the past 100 years. But such things have evolved. We have more publications here. In fact, in Singapore, in the 1950s, 60s, we are the hub in Southeast Asia for Chinese publication. In terms of the volume of Chinese publication, it actually exceeds the summation for Malay, Tamil, and English. There was a time where there are a lot of Chinese publications. And we are slowly, and because also of nation building, we're slowly building a Singapore Chinese literature identity. And right now, yes, of course, you still have the most number of readers and writers in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. But I think in Singapore, especially in this part of the world, there's a new kind of writing that has been emerging. Writing about this area, our own culture, a multicultural Singapore, even a multilingual kind of literature that evolved in Singapore. I think that's quite special here.
Yeah. Dr. Tan, if I may add a bit, similar to the case of the Chinese Mandarin literature and Malay literature, especially Singapore, we can't divorce from the Malaysian literature. Even Chinese literature in Singapore. It's impossible, for you to trace, even for the case of Malay literature. So, because, we were part of British Malaya, and we were also part of, this entity called Malaysian Federation, right?
Yeah.
So our kind of literature back in the 50s and 60s, right, evolved and developed within that trajectory.
Yeah, I think there's really a colonial connection that our literature shares, right?
So, Dr. Tan, you just mentioned that literature has evolved into a form of multilingual literature. You made that comment earlier. So, what do you have to say about it on a personal level?
In fact, in our first poetry festival, Singapore, we had 4 poets going on stage and reciting one poem in different languages. So that, I thought, is the spirit of Poetry Festival Singapore, embracing our different cultures and different languages and showing off it in one poem.
Okay, another question for the two of you. When we compare our mother tongue literature vis-a-vis the local English literature, how involved do you think our readers and writers are in literary engagement?
Well, we see a lot of youngsters today are writing in English. This is a good thing, of course, is in the development of Singapore's literature, regardless of the language. I think to have more people to be interested in literature is a good thing overall. However, we are also concerned that for the mother tongue, we don't see many young people joining the ranks of writing and treating writing as a serious profession. Right. That's why I think through many activities that we organize, Poetry Festival Singapore, and a lot of fringe activities that we have, like competition and so on, we are hoping that these youngsters may be interested to join us. No, I think this is the case whereby English being the lingua franca in Singapore, every subject that they study is in English, so their strength will be in that language. However, we also see a lot of clans, associations, organizations trying their very best to promote mother tongue writing. So I think all of us to try our very best to promote this, and using novel ways, interesting ways, even using ICT technology to engage the young people, to let them see that mother tongue writing and literature is something which deserves much more effort and is really very interesting to take part in.
Well, for my observation, right, the difference between, say, English and the other mother tongue languages, one is actually, which I can term as style of thinking. In that sense, in English, it's a globalized language plugged with this international world, yeah, international literature and so on. So it has that kind of a flavor of things global. Whereas for vernacular, which is one thing which is quite good, I don't like to use the word vernacular.
Yeah,
mother
I'm
tongue,
trying
right?
to say mother
Yes,
tongue.
Mother tongue, yeah, that would be good. Mother tongue languages, the kind of the organic commitment with the community, right? It is localized, I would say, over time, especially for the case of Malay literature. And I think also, from my readings on Tamil or even Mandarin, over time, it is more, organically localized, right? That part, I think literature demands also, that we cover, the local setting. All right. Of course, we want to celebrate the global world, but we cannot forget our own organic and this contextual geopolitics that we are faced with.
I think the local setting actually can connect with the young people better, because if you keep telling them that, when you, let's say, study Chinese literature, you have to go back to China or Taiwan or other places, it's quite distant, right, to a certain extent. But if we can make local literature in a local setting interesting,
Exactly.
and because these are the places, these are the people, and the language that they know, and it's just around them, they find it interesting, they may be willing to read and write more.
And then, of course, literature is the way that people could understand us. We write about ourselves, and the world need to know us too, in that sense, right? We have been no problem of embracing the world. But of course, I think, our contribution to world literature itself one day, demands of our seriousness in looking at our mother tongue literature.
Dr. Azhar, you made a very interesting point about how our mother tongue literatures focus on the local, and how English literature in general focuses on international subjects, if you put it that way. So do you think our local mother tongue languages are moving in the direction of the international, addressing global issues? Do you see that coming?
Certainly. First of all, we need to define what is this global theme or global subject, right? Different parts of the world have its global concern, all right? You can say, the writers in the past, say in the 50s, 60s, their notion of globality, right, demands that solidarity with the world, right? The working class, that kind of humanism, that was the concern. That was the generation before. But today we have another global concern, like say, the environment, right? Human trafficking, terrorism, and the, what I call it, state authoritarianism, all those kind of things. These are our global concerns. I would say that the younger writers are moving in that direction, but we need to encourage them more. Because there's a tendency that the younger writers today, because of being this, this ideological or, this socialization of ideas, that your identity equals to your ethnicity. Whereas I think that is only just a small fraction of your identity. Your identity is not just your ethnicity. So if younger writers are able to go beyond that identity is not just ethnicity, they will able to take up more, just like their predecessor decades ago.
So the two of you were talking a lot about youngsters and our engagement with literature, right? I just wanted to ask this question because Ashwini and I had this discussion amongst ourselves talking about whether this problem is particularly related to youth or is it a general societal problem, broadly speaking. Because for us personally, we do encounter adults as well who may not be engaging with literature as much as they could, if not for the barriers that they face with engaging with the language and literature. So the question is it really just us?
You're quite right, actually, to be fair to youngsters. The problem or the question is not only with the youngsters. It is a societal problem whereby we do not have a lot of people among us who read and write literature. But that's always the case. You mean writers is a very selective field, to be very frank. But even this very selective field, we are not seeing enough coming from the youngsters. So that's why we are bringing this out. We always hope that for every generation will have their own writers in the mother tongue. But right now we feel that we don't have enough people coming, and then the reason probably is because we don't see them reading enough. So once you don't read enough, you don't write enough, right? So that's the current situation.
Yeah, if I can add, well, if you look at reading culture and so on, perhaps maybe they read more in English as compared to mother tongue. That's number one. And number two, the structures itself are not supporting on how literature itself, right, becomes a respected field in that sense. Yeah, and also let's look at our education system, right? How much the component of literature being given that recognition. Often at times when we heard about literature, it's always tied up to enhance your language competency. I think that is actually a misleading framing of issues or framing of problems. I think literature should stand on its own, right? You can build up language competency, via various fields, such as, say, language study itself or critical literacy, but give more prominence to literature.
Speaking of language competencies, in our last episode, we were talking about Mr. P. Krishnan, who is a pioneer writer and translator in Tamil, and he has extensively translated Shakespeare's English plays into Tamil. So banging on that, actually, how about bilingual literature? Is that a form that is being explored now in Mandarin or in Malay?
Well, just now I mentioned the multilingual literature, so it's not only bilingual. But let's look at bilingual first. Yes, we do have writers writing in two languages and in the same article or same poem. Because actually, to be very frank, all of us, or a lot of us, are actually trained in two languages. We have our mother tongue and English. But it seems that when we write, we tend to choose only one. We become very purist. Why is that so? Because we are afraid that people won't understand? No, actually, almost everybody who's trained in Singapore, who's educated in Singapore, has gone through the bilingual education. So why are we not writing? So some of these writers become aware of this and become experimental in writing bilingual literature. Yes, we do have Chinese writers writing in Chinese and Malay. It's not only very current, no. It's about, let's say, 100 years ago, we have scholars who's writing in Chinese classical poem, but using Malay translation. So the word you see is in Chinese. For example, Mali, Ma Bu, Ma Bu. So actually it's Malay, Ma Bu, Mati, and so on. So if you know two languages, you will find that poem very interesting. So we have this tradition 100 years ago. And right now in Singapore, I do know of some young writers who are also quite experimental. And they use Singlish with Chinese, dialect with Chinese, and all other languages with Chinese. Right.
The significance of bilingual or bicultural is that you become a cultural broker. You bring in one corpus into another and vice versa. Right? I mean, if you are, let's say, you are very much into the Malay-Indonesian corpus, right? But when you write in English, you are able to transfer that kind of corpus into the medium of English, and vice versa. If you are educated in English but you write in Malay, you are able to bring all this global corpus in English into the Malay Indonesian language. I think that's something, well, when we talk about bilingual in Singapore, it becomes just like, your mother tongue as second language, but still English is the primary medium, right? Our very notion of bilingual itself, I think, we have yet to revisit it.
I think I agree that we shouldn't be compartmentalizing so much, right? Like, if this is really the way we think, then let it show in the way we write, right?
This is the way we talk, actually. When we talk, we usually mix languages together, we code switch and so on. But why do we not write in such a way as what we think? I think the reason is because we are purists and we are trained to think that, literature needs to have only one language and it's the best of the language. But coming to think of it, people like us because of our difference. They want to read us because we have our own identity. And if we can write in this way, I think there are a lot of scholars and readers overseas who are actually quite interested in our bilingual way of writing.
And that experimented historically, right, by the Chinese Peranakan in Southeast Asia, 100 and 150 years ago. They write in Malay. Some would say, it's Bazaar Malay or, lower Malay, doesn't matter. But in terms of their corpus, they get it from the Chinese sources and they write it in Malay. And then you can see their contribution itself to the development of Malay Indonesian language and literature. I mean, that was experimented before. And it shows that kind of, the creativity on those groups. And at the same time, because they are aware of the classical Malay literature, right, it gives an added impetus to the Peranakan literature.
Even within the language itself, for example, for Chinese, there are a lot of vocabulary in Singapore which is different from that of China or Taiwan and other places. And if we want them to understand and we only write in their own vocabulary, for example, market in China is 市场, but in Singapore we call it pasar because of pasar, right? It's from Malay. And if we write in this way, it represents us. But if we keep using 市场 the way that Chinese use in China, it loses flavor. And you know that it's not from Singapore. And we would never call our market 市场, right? Yeah.
I think one thing that was very interesting was that when I asked you the question about bilingual literature, I had the assumption that when we speak of bilingual literature, it's usually our mother tongue language and English, right? But now that I realize that, it can also include dialects and Chinese, Malay and Chinese, like Malay and Tamil maybe. So I think that is a very interesting viewpoint to look at bilingual literature.
And I think we really need to stay curious about our other languages and other literary fields in Singapore, right? Right now we are just talking about our 4 official languages, but there's so much more, isn't there? There's Tagalog, there's Bengali, there's so much in Singapore. Okay, now that we are coming towards the conclusion of our session today, and I'm actually feeling rather sad about this, Ashwinii. So I think let's end with talking about hope. So our question to you both is there hope for our literature?
Of course. You have to answer immediately. But I really think we do have a bright future. Literature will never die. It is part and parcel of us. It's our humanity, it's our identity. You need the voice of literature to pass your ideas, your identity, and what you feel about the world, and where you find beauty in the world. You need language in literature to pass it down to the next generation. And it is only through literature that you can access this special beauty, not found in sciences, not found in economics and other subjects. It's only in literature, so it will never die. Yes, there are always ups and downs, alright? Sometimes where we do not have enough people coming, reading or writing, but I believe our literature will always live on, and if we persist, let's say, for example, your program is an effort in the right direction, promoting literature. And we are also doing Poetry Festival Singapore and many other activities to promote literature, so it will definitely have a bright future.
Certainly I will agree, but the hope must be a concrete hope, with high optimism, and that also warrants our planning. Every time we have hope, it means also a vision. A vision warrants a planning, meaning that there must be a conscious effort of how do we revisit those earlier experience, earlier practices. At the same time, how do we move forward? One example is actually translation, right? I mean, this is one way for us to know each other, right? But at least within our own domain. To rely on or to just simply demand that, the education system, right, should be the one that provide literature. I think, that kind of hope or that kind of vision may not be, it's good. We have, structures and institutions to support, but that's not the only way, right? I mean, community efforts, right? Organizational efforts within the community and trans community must able to forge together. I mean, as agreed with Dr. Tan, your kind of effort like this is one way in which we can make a realization. In fact, I was thinking, look, there's friends from the Tamil literary community doing this kind of podcast or interview like this, of this sort, it's admirable, and I'm telling, and this will be, I think, a good format for us to know each other, apart from building our own domain, right? So hope must be concrete, and concrete calls for planning.
If you add what Azhar said and I said together, is planning, ground up, with passion and belief, I think definitely we will have a bright future.
I totally agree.
Thank you, Dr. Tan, and thank you, Dr. Azhar. I think we are certainly on our way to go.
Thank you both for a very, very inspiring interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Our pleasure.
Our pleasure, yes.
சிங்கப்பூரின் தனித்துவமே நமது பன்மொழி தன்மைதான். நம்ம மொழியை தக்க வைக்க வேண்டிய சவால் நம்மளுடைய 2 பேராசிரியர்களும் சொன்ன மாதிரி எல்லா மொழிகளுக்கும் மொழி சமூகங்களுக்கும் உள்ளது. பொதுவான பயன்பாட்டு மொழியாக ஆங்கிலம் இருக்கிற வரைக்கும் இந்த பிரச்சனை கண்டிப்பா இருக்கும்.
தலைமுறைகளுக்கு இடையிலான வேறுபாடுகளை பத்தியும் நாம இன்னைக்கு பேசணும். இளைய தலைமுறையினர் சிந்திக்கக்கூடிய விதம், காலப்போக்கில் அதுல ஏற்பட்டுள்ள மாற்றங்களை பற்றியும் நம்ம இன்னைக்கு பேசணும்.
நம்ம 2 பேராசிரியர்களும் சொன்ன மாதிரி சிங்கப்பூர் இலக்கியம் நம்மளுடைய காலனித்துவ வரலாறோட பின்னி பிணைந்திருக்கு. இலக்கியத்தையும் வரலாறையும் நம்மளால பிரிச்சு பார்க்க முடியாது. அதே போல தாய்மொழி இலக்கியங்களுக்கு ஒரு குறிப்பிட்ட அம்சம் இருக்கு. நம்முடைய உள்ளூர் இலக்கியம் அப்படின்னு நம்ம பார்க்கும் பொழுது ஒரு உள்ளூர் வாசனையை நம்ம பிரதிபலிக்கிறோம் அப்படின்னு 2 பேருமே சொன்னாங்க. அதாவது நம்ம சிங்கப்பூர்ல பேசக்கூடிய கருப்பொருள்கள், இங்க இருக்கக்கூடிய சவால்களை பேசும் பொழுது நம்மளுடைய இலக்கியம் வலுப்பெறுகிறது. ஆனா அண்மை காலங்கள்ல இத ஒரு உலகமயமாதலோட ஒட்டிய ஒரு இலக்கியமாக கொண்டு போறதுக்கான முயற்சிகளும் மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்டு வருது. அந்த முயற்சிகள் புதிய பரிசோதனை முயற்சிகளாகவும் இருக்கு.
அது மட்டும் இல்லாம நம்முடைய சிந்தனையை பிரதிபலிக்கணும் நம்முடைய மொழி அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு முக்கியமான கருத்தை டாக்டர் தானும் சரி, டாக்டர் அசாரும் முன் வச்சாங்க. நமது தாய்மொழிய வாழ்க்கையில நாம ஒரு அங்கமாக்கும் போது அதை தக்க வைக்க வேண்டிய சவாலை நம்ம எளிதா எதிர்கொள்ளலாம். அந்த மாதிரி எதிர்கொள்றதுக்கு நம்முடைய இலக்கியம் கை கொடுக்கும். டாக்டர் தான் சொன்ன மாதிரி பிலீவ், பேஷன் அண்ட் பிளானிங். முதல்ல நம்பிக்கையோட நம்முடைய இலக்கியத்துல ஈடுபடணும். அதுல ஈடுபடணும் அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு ஆர்வம் இருக்கும்போது அதற்கான திட்டங்களை நாம மேற்கொண்டு அதை செயல்படுத்த முடியும். இந்த பாகத்தை கேட்ட நேயர்கள் அனைவருக்கும் நன்றி. எங்களுடைய தொடருக்கு ஆதரவளித்து வரும் தேசிய கலைகள் மன்றத்திற்கும் எங்களது மனமார்ந்த நன்றி.
எங்களுடன் தொடர்ந்து இணைந்திருக்க இந்த வலையொலிகளுக்கு நீங்க சப்ஸ்கிரைப் செய்யலாம். அதோட சமூக வலைத்தளங்கள்ல இவற்றை பகிர்ந்து கொண்டு எங்களுடைய Facebook மற்றும் Instagram பக்கங்கள்ல உங்களுடைய கருத்துக்களையும் நீங்க எங்களுக்கு தெரிவிக்கலாம். நான் அஸ்வினி.
நான் ஆயிலிஷா.
இது சொல்லிலடங்கா
இளையர்களின் இலக்கிய பயணம்.